the story that Mary, she came from Galilee, searching for a lodging. Mary and Joseph and their son to be. It was in a stable down the road, a humble stable down the road, a stable down the road.
Good afternoon and welcome to Artists of Color. And I am your host, Elaine Hall-Corbin. And today we have a very special guest. And before I tell you who he is, I must say, Christmas to me is not Christmas until Black Nativity rolls around. And I want to say thank you, Mr. Edmond Gaither, Executive Director of the National Center of Afro-American Artists, for being with me this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to join you.
It's wonderful. I went to see the show this past Sunday and I was amazed.
Well, this season's show is very beautiful. The choral sound, the new voices, they all are absolutely rhapsodic. So I think if you come, and you come with openness, your spirit will be lifted, and you will be infused with the joy of the season.
Thank you. And I understand what you're saying, because when it first started and the first selection came about, I started to cry. Well, and that was for me, I said, I couldn't believe this. I'm actually crying.
It has become for you what it is for many. A marker of the season. It announces that we're entering the period when we really need to emphasize goodwill. And that's what Black Nativity says. We have positioned it over the years as a gift from Boston's Black community to men and women of goodwill of all traditions. And we invite everyone to come and share in that.
Wonderful. You know what, I would like for you to give my audience a brief history of how Black Nativity came to the National Center of Afro-American Artists.
In 1970, the governing board, the directors of the National Center of Afro-American Artists, were a genuinely national group. And they convened to meet 4 times a year. Each time they met, we performed something for them or had a special exhibition for them so they could see what they were supporting from the various different places where they lived. So as we were approaching the winter season and the winter meeting of the Board of Directors in 1970, we turned our attention to what would we do as the special thing for the meeting. It was in that context that John Andrew Ross, who was Director of Music for the National Center and the Elma Lewis School of Fine Arts, came forward with the suggestion that we do Langston Hughes's Black Nativity. John had some previous experience with the production because John's father and Langston were great personal friends. They had been schoolmates together at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. So what happened was whenever Langston would come to Boston, he would stay at John's house. And John thought of him like an uncle. When the traveling show made the circuit in the 1960s and the show came to Boston. John saw it, and later there was conversation about it at his house. In the course of that conversation, John learned that Langston had not been entirely happy with the music of the original show, because the music for the original show had been set for an adult gospel singing group. So John had meditated on this and had formed his own ideas about how the show could be made still better. So the way the center operated, Miss Lewis convened all of her lieutenants every Wednesday at noon. John always came late, but everyone else came on time. And we discussed the upcoming programs. And it was her opportunity to share her philosophy about the work and to comment on the things that were in the pipeline. So John came to the meeting, and when his term came around to contribute, he said he thought we should do Black Nativity for the winter board meeting. Now, Miss Lewis, who had really grown up more in Anglican tradition, was not so big a gospel person, but she had no objection to it. But I think she was waiting to see how this was going to play out. And John enjoyed her favor. And if John wanted to do it, then we were going to give it a fair chance. So John presents the idea, and everything is going along smoothly. Now, we had two directors of dance. Billy Wilson was the artistic director of the dance company of the National Center of Afro-American Artists. The dance company did choreography similar to what Alvin's company does nowadays. We also had George Howard. George Howard worked from African and Afro-Caribbean musical traditions and worked in the Dunham method, which had established.
What is the Dunham method?
Well, Catherine Dunham,
Dunham,
she had devised a way of organizing dance that was appropriate to Afro-Caribbean expression. And she had codified that so it could be taught as a way of teaching that dance. George had danced with her in New York, and that was the way that he approached making the dance. So John had to decide between George and Afro-Caribbean stations, staging for the movement, or Billy. Now, Vernon Blackman was going to be in charge of the stagecraft because Vernon was our director of theater and drama. So we're all waiting to see who John's going to ask to do the choreography. At last, John asked George. George had a way of expressing when he was thinking about something. So George took a long pause. And at the end of the pause, he said, "If I do the choreography, Mary is going to have that baby." And he said it with just that kind of emphasis. That's the origin of the quite extraordinary pas de deux between Mary and Joseph that stands at the core of the production, and it is also the genesis of the Dance of Mary, or the image of the Dancing Mary, which came to be the icon for Black Nativity. So if you look on our programs or any of our advertisements over the 47 years we've done the show, you will see the Dancing Mary, as the image that always, with the fancy script above it, announces the coming of Black Nativity. So we mounted the show, and we didn't at the time have a clear notion that it would become an annual thing. We mounted it really for that meeting of the board, but it was so well received and generated such excitement that we settled into the notion that we should make it an annual event. Now, when we did the first one, we were up on Elm Hill Avenue.
Yes.
And basically, the theater space that we had on Elm Hill Avenue was what they used to call a gymtorium. It was like a gym, but it had a raised stage.
Yes, I remember.
It seated maybe 400 crowded. Wow. And we figured out the staging so that the procession and everything that needed to happen could happen, but the space and the performance created a wonderful intimacy. Everything was very close, very immediate. You were in the middle of it, and the spirit of it was very powerful. Now, on the scary side of it, in those days, we used actual candles.
Yes, we did.
So all of the children came in with their candles and a little cardboard disc to prevent the wax from running onto their hands. And we all were on needles and pins that they keep their distance.
From each other, yes.
Eventually, the fire marshal made that no longer possible.
Yeah.
So we use the
electric ones.
Battery-powered candles now. But at the beginning, we actually used the real candles. And the show just had a magic. After that, we were looking for a larger house. And over the next years, we did the show at Northeastern University, at Roxbury Community College, at the Opera House before it was restored, and many years at Tremont Temple.
Yes.
And over all of those years and all of those spaces, a percentage of annual viewers found us and came and shared all of this. And it's because of them that this has become a cherished tradition in Boston.
Barry, I love the history because now it's brought us to this particular time and space and place in history in the 21st century. And, you know, I want to talk about some of those that make Black Nativity possible. For beginning with Von Seal Ross, tell me about her. Tell me about her space and place in.
Well, I'm happy to reply and respond to your question, but I have to go further back than Von Seal. I think if we're going to sort of think about the people who have been crucial for this, it may be useful to think about them roughly in order.
Okay.
That goes back with the founding group being Miss Lewis, who was the artistic director of the National Center and the executive producer of Black Nativity.
Right.
So everything was under her purview. And immediately beneath her purview, there was Vernon Blackman, who was responsible for the theater portion.
Yes.
Vernon was with the show and served that function until his death. And Vernon was the teacher for Von Seal when she was first with us, before she had even finished the work that is her professional training, because she had been in our cast and part of the group of young people that we mentored and tutored and directed towards artistic development. So Vernon is certainly important in that early mix. George Howard, whom I mentioned before, George commuted 2 to 3 days a week from New York, from Harlem,
wow.
to teach African drums for the Elma Lewis School of Fine Arts. And he did that over many years.
I remember him.
In the course of that, he taught a little bit of Yoruba, which is how he used the language to help people learn the drum beats and everything. So he created a core of performers playing African drums. These were young people, teenagers, and adults. So the music that's behind the dance of Mary and Joseph is music which comes out of the work that Olatunji was doing with our students at the school. Just a fast note on Olatunji. Michael Babatunde Olatunji had come to the United States from Nigeria in the early 70s and had attended Morehouse College in Atlanta. And he is responsible substantially for introducing African music into the American musical scene. So it was a significant thing that he came to us, to our students right here in Boston, for that long period of time to directly transfer this African musical tradition to our young students. So we had a body of students there who'd come out of his work, and when they performed outside of Black Nativity, they were generally called the African Heritage Ensemble.
Oh,
and
okay.
they performed inside the piece as the musicians. So Olatunji fits there. Now, Olatunji and George are connected at the hip in this.
Okay.
Because, of course, African music without dance is unthinkable.
Yes,
and
it is.
African dance without drums
Is
is
unthinkable.
unthinkable.
Yes.
So those two things merged together and became this powerful force that was harnessed by Vernon and Miss Lewis in putting things together. When it came to the choral portion, the actual singing, that was John Ross's work. And John did several distinguished and distinctive things with that. As I noted earlier, the original performance had been with a gospel singing group. Okay. So there were not children in it. John arranged and set the music for youngsters. And by bringing children into the show, it brought a new lilt, a new mix of voices, a new kind of joy, and a very particular kind of innocence. All of those pieces of this music setting for children have been retained over the many years. So at the end of the show, when a single small child sings the very last bits of music that close the evening, that kind of setting for a child was one of the things that John arranged and made part of the show. So the balance of the show, the mix of voices, choral and solo, all of that John initially set, and John kept that in place and managed it as an innovation within a tradition up until his death. John is there until 2006. After John's death, the music is divided, and we have an adult choral director and a choral director for youngsters. So Marilyn Andre becomes the director for the children, and Milton Wright becomes the choral director for the adults.
I want to ask, not to interrupt, but
Yes.
I want to ask, is that how the tradition of John and Vernon Blackman and all of those that came before, is that how the tradition keeps going through those who were students before?
Yes, the tradition has remained secure because a critical number of participants in each season had been trained and cultivated over previous seasons. In this year's show, we have two people who have been in every season since 1970. So you might say we have some built-in institutional memory
Yes.
that stretches over that whole period of time. Now, I've had an executive responsibility for Black Nativity only for a short period of time, because I've only carried that work since the death of Miss Lewis in 2004. Before that, my strong connection was for many years I made the manger, because we could never keep up with it from one year to the next.
Oh my goodness.
And at the beginning, we were making a new star every year, and that fell to the art department. At some point along the way, they did get those things together, but that was a kind of footnote in the history of all of this. So I was telling you about the music role. John's role had been so large and of such majesty that after his death, it became the role of two people. And that's Marilyn and Milton.
And Milton,
And they carry that forward. The dance has really been carried forward very strongly by Desiree. And Desiree had danced and still does sometimes the role of Mary, so she knows intimately the choreography of the show. And over the time period, she has been responsible for training many other Marys and Josephs who have played at one time or another. Now, at the beginning, Vernon was the person who prepared the narrator, because the narrator role is a big and important role.
Yes.
I think Fred Johnson, who used to direct our mime company, was certainly among the earliest of narrators, and Vernon did himself sometimes perform the role of the narrator.
Yep.
Over the period of time, Von Seal has performed the role of the narrator, and Milton has also, as well as others. So we've had a number of narrators over the years, but Vernon was the person who gave that a coloration and first launched it into place. Now, what am I missing? I've covered dance and movement, I've covered the music, the costuming.
Before you go to the costuming, I have a question regarding the music. I've noticed for many years, the groups you have, the Voices of Black Persuasion,
Yes.
and the Young Voices of Black Persuasion.
Yes.
How was that name, Black Persuasion, come about?
Well, very early in the music department, at the beginning of the music department, John was responsible for everything.
Right.
For music instruction and for the work that happened under National Center of Afro-American Artists. So that meant that John, like all of us who were directors of programs, was responsible for the programmatic activity as Elma Lewis School of Fine Arts, as well as the programmatic activity as National Center of Afro-American Artists.
Okay.
A little bit into the music department, John brought Betty Hillman. Betty is still deeply involved with the show, and Betty took on in the department overseeing music instruction. And John then focused his attention more on music performance, and performance became at the center of his teaching. We were also doing a lot of outside shows and appearances. So out of his work with performance, John created two entities: Voices of the Black Persuasion, which were sort of adolescent and up, including adults,
Yes.
but they were choral performers, and John worked with them as a discrete group. Then the children of Black Persuasion were the younger students with whom he worked as students of performance. The very earliest program, I don't think distinguishes persuasion, Black persuasion, in the identification. But it isn't far along in the shows before the youngsters in the listing of the cast start to be sorted into children of the Black Persuasion, which told you those were young students, and Voices of the Black Persuasion, which then subsumed everybody else. But that really grew out of this distinction between the teaching of performance and the musical instruments, voice theory, and all of the instructional offerings for which Betty was responsible. Now, speaking of Betty, it's useful to now make another connection, which is Miss Lewis had always deeply valued the educational role of the show.
Yes.
Because she was always a teacher at heart. And she believed that if you didn't teach youngsters to fail, they wouldn't. So she said when children fail, it's because adults have taught them to be frightened and to fail.
Yes.
So she took a great pride in the fact that you could start with youngsters in the fall, some of whom had never really been on stage, and you could get them to a place where they could perform for the public without a director standing there and telling them what to do. Because our performance requires that you internalize not just the music, but the action, where you're supposed to be, when you're supposed to be there, how you're supposed to behave. It's a kind of total training thing. And she saw it as really important that youngsters learn to do this and gain the confidence to believe in their own creativity and their own ability to stand up and matter. So
we're going to take a short break, and you're going to come back and we are going to continue this conversation because I'm enthralled. It's things I did not know that I'm learning. So I do want us to continue. We'll be right back.
Watch them now, when was Jesus born? Blasphemy. Oh, when was Jesus born? Blasphemy. I wanna know, when was he born? Blasphemy. Now was it January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, no. Was it December? Yes, blasphemy. So now, when was Jesus born? Blasphemy. Oh, when was Jesus born? Blasphemy. I wanna know, when was he born?
afternoon and welcome back to Artists of Color. And today my show is centered around the great Christmas show, Black Nativity, and with us is Mr. Edmond Barry Gaither, Executive Director of the National Center of Afro-American Artists. Barry, thanks for coming on, and I thank you for being with me today.
Great to join you.
Oh, I am so happy. And again, as I've said, I got to see the show this past Sunday, and I was enthralled. I loved it. And I do want you to continue with our conversation that we were just having before we went on break, talking about the music and talking about Aunt Elma teaching. She always felt that children should be taught not to fail. And that was actually her mission, for that never to happen.
Yes, there are actually lots of photographs in our archive of Miss Lewis talking, especially with the youngest members of the cast, because she did want to give them that confidence. Sometimes, when you're really small, you need adults to invest that confidence in you, to give you the spine that lets you get out there and do what you may not have thought you could. So she was really building that resourcefulness and confidence, and that became part of what still goes on behind the stage in the preparation for the show. Over the few months between when auditions happen for the season and when the performance actually begins. Mrs. Thacker, who up until the last year or so was one of the cast mothers
Yes,
behind the scene. Betty Hillman, who's been very invested in preserving the education function. They have taken on and continued that piece of Miss Lewis's work that is the personal development support, especially for the youngsters. Now, the other thing that Miss Lewis saw and valued was she also saw that the cast offered an opportunity for the adults in the cast to model behavior for the youngsters.
Oh.
I mean, we have tried to avoid any of the kinds of misbehaviors
Yes, we
that
have.
are not uncommon in the theater world today. And the adult members of the cast are very aware of themselves as building the character of the
little ones,
youngsters.
that's right.
And as modeling appropriate behaviors, and as, in short, helping to give to these youngsters a legacy of excellence and of upright character. And I think that is a really important piece of the work that Black Nativity has sought to sustain. It's part of what we invest in every time around with this show.
I want to talk about casting. I know you always start auditions around the end of October, or actually, no, the beginning of October. And what I want to know is, how is casting done? In other words, what's the process?
The casting and all of those mechanics of the show are very much in the domain of Von Seal, who is the executive producer, director of the show. It's her job to get all of the pieces in place. My role is really to make sure we have a place and that we have some kind of budget with which to get things underway. But the actual sustaining of the show and the recreation of the show every year is vested in the artistic and production cast, of which Von Seal is the topmost person. So the announcement goes out, usually in September, that we're coming up to a new season. it goes out with an invitation to previous participants, but also an invitation to any newcomers, be they youngster, teen, or adult, who are interested in joining the cast. And there are a few nights of auditions, and you'd have to come and basically present yourself, and the artistic staff who are responsible for the show would then decide from those who've presented themselves who will be invited into the cast. Now, it's worth keeping in mind that our cast is nearly 75. And if you go to any particular show, there are likely to be 55 or so people that you see at one time on the stage. But because we do 12 shows, there's always some reserve and some rotation over the course of events, as is characteristic for shows that produce in multiple performances.
All right. Okay. So so once you have casting started and once the auditions are done, when do rehearsals begin?
Rehearsals usually begin very early in November, and by Thanksgiving they have to be pretty far along, because depending on where Thanksgiving falls in the month,
Right.
and when our first show comes up, our dress rehearsal, that's a very important piece of the preparation,
Yes.
will happen just after Thanksgiving, usually. I'm not sure if we weren't just before Thanksgiving this year, because we started on December 1st.
Right.
But generally, it's pretty close to Thanksgiving when the dress rehearsal happens.
Okay. And when do you start casting for Baby Jesus?
Oh, the Baby Jesus is our youngest cast member.
I know.
And in a certain sense, our most adorable cast member. I mean, if you can imagine this, Mary and Joseph are first on the road.
Right.
And there's music and choreography for the on the road part. And finally, Joseph's best effort has failed to produce a haven.
Haven, yes.
And
baby.
They must now settle for the stable. And Mary cast off the mantle, and Joseph, she finally pushes away, and then it becomes Mary's dance.
Yep.
Now, Mary's dance is an exquisite choreography of labor. So you see her in the contortions with the body. Responding to the pains of labor, and that's all danced out to the audience in all directions. And finally, she goes to the drums, and she dances this out before the drums. And by this point, the contortions are already rapid. And finally, she's in a spin. And at the end of the spin, we see her holding the newborn Christ child very close to her bosom. And by this time, Joseph comes, bringing the manger. And she puts the newborn into the manger. Then they slowly back to the front of the stage.
Yes.
He bringing the manger, and she in place for a moment. He places the manger, and then he goes back to get her and bring her to the manger. So they make the slow procession, and as they get to the manger, she looks, and for the first time, she sees the baby Jesus. The audience has gotten a sneak preview, because when the manger gets put down, usually the wrapping is opened and you see the little arms that play. But it's not until he brings her And she looks and sees the little arms, that the full realization of the birth is manifested. And she swoons. And as she swoons, she falls backwards. The drums reach a crescendo, and the house lights die. And that's the climax of that dance. And it's the climax of this dramatic moment that's the conclusion to the choreographed labor. And it's the stellar appearance of the newborn youngest cast member. Because almost always when the lights come up again and the music begins again, Mary will lift the child and hold him in her arms. And that's the first opportunity for everyone in the audience to have a fuller image of the child than just the little arms playing in the air. So it's all really quite wonderful and very magical. And even if you've been many times,
it's still
and
magical.
You know that this is what's going to happen, still, when you see those little movements, you can't help but be swept away in the joy of the moment.
How old is, now to the casting for the baby, how old does the little one have to be in order to presume that?
Now, for this question, I will have to plead innocence, because I don't actually know the answer to that question, except I know that the infant cannot be very old.
Okay.
So I think it's a matter of a very few weeks, maybe not even 2 or 3. I don't think so, because you do want a really young child, and I tell you, already the child has a temperament.
Oh, yes,
so
I know.
Usually we're trying to find a youngster who will listen to the music and everything and be quite all right. But every now and then we get a youngster who wants to cry.
I can imagine. I think I've seen a couple of those. When, and that was going to be my next.
Well, of course, we must know that the historical child would have cried sometimes too.
Absolutely.
Don't they all?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And that was going to say, okay, so you realize, you know, it's the temperament of the baby and all that. Does the baby get fed before going on stage?
Now this is all the minutia of the management.
Okay.
And I can't answer all of those questions.
You can't.
I just look to see that it comes out all right.
Okay.
So the next time I come, I will have fortified myself with these questions that are too difficult.
Oh, we'll be fine.
Yes.
Tell me about the narration, the narrator. Like this year it was Von Seal.
Yes.
And I remember that. How does the narrator prepare for, a production of this magnitude?
Well, here it's also important to make a couple of advance comments. Langston Hughes, who put together Black Nativity, is a genuine writer and poet of the Harlem Renaissance, and often called the poet laureate of the people, because he loved ordinary black people. Mm-hmm. He loved the music, blues, gospel. He loved the speech. And he loved the tendency to tell stories. So what he does in this piece is he takes the New Testament scripture that is the basis for the story of the Nativity, and at key points he converts it into contemporary vernacular speech, as if this were a 20th century conversation that you were overhearing between ordinary working black people about this extraordinary event. So, for example, in the passage that deals with no room at the end, there's a point at which the the words say that the butler, the cook, the maid, I mean, all of these people who are service workers
Yes.
in the hotel
No.
as it exists now, that all of these characters are there as if they were at what would have been this ancient scene, and they are not happy with the way the management is doing
treating
this.
yes.
So it says that they're going to bear witness against them in the judgment. Now, this is a conversion of how we talk about the news right now. This is how some of us talk about the Donald Trump era.
Yes.
So he converts this sacred text, preserving at key points the language of the old text, but all in between, he weaves it together with language taken from the world of black people that he knew. And that familiarity helps to make the show accessible in a way that's very different from a pageant. Now, in a pageant, you often simply have the quotation of the text as it appeared in the New Testament. And the narrator sometimes does that in order to anchor it in relationship to the New Testament. But when the narrator comes out talking about born in a hotel that has no name, you know, that just switches this right into the now.
Yes.
So the juxtaposition between the historical narrative as the New Testament presents it, and Langston Hughes' sense of how this would get discussed in the Harlem that he grew up in, or any
Folks
other
sitting
black
around a
American
table
community.
and having a discussion.
Yes, that translation is what keeps it accessible, easy to get into, and also preserves a certain humor to it, because there is always a little bit of a doubled edge in the language, in that it is at once about this most serious story, but also because it's like your aunt or your uncle or your grandparents talking, there's also this other piece of it that's really kind of arrestingly familiar.
Because I've read a number of Langston Hughes's works, and I love his writing, you know, and how he puts things together. It's more like he's talking about what's going on daily or what's happened in the past to black folks.
Well, I tell you, I can quote you my favorite Langston Hughes
Which
poem.
one?
And I can do it because it's also his shortest one.
Okay.
The whole poem is, "It's such a bore being poor."
Yes, it is.
And probably the Langston Hughes that people know best is "Life for Me Ain't Been No Crystal Stair."
I love that.
And because it's a scene, you know, of a mother talking to her child. About the expectation that the child has that things are easy.
Right.
And she's saying, you know, this hasn't been easy for me, and I paid a price for the space you're in.
Yes.
So I didn't pay that price for nothing. I'm expecting some accomplishment. So it's a poem
Absolutely.
that every parent could quote to their school-age child right now.
You know, you're right. You're absolutely right. You can. I mean, we can, as parents, quote that, especially as black parents, to our children, you know. We've done what we've done, and we've done it for you. Now I'm expecting something in return.
We can say that about Black Nativity.
Yes, we can.
We've spent 47 years forging a continuous tradition in order to be able to give to who comes to perform, but also who comes to experience a living tradition. You can't invent the 47 years. We actually did that, and made that, and it is a reality. But what does it mean? It means when you join the show, you take on the responsibility of building on something given to you. It's an obligation as well as an opportunity. And that's something that each year, when I speak to the cast after the first performance, I remind the youngsters. I say, you know, you're being given a responsibility and an opportunity, and they're both coming in the same package. You're at the front end of a living tradition, and you move it forward, and at the same time you become part of it. And you create something that you can give to your own children.
That's true.
And that kind of living legacy is something that really matters to us. And when you look around the season and you look at Nutcracker, for example, other pieces that are now traditions,
Yes.
God bless everyone who has invested enough in who they are to make a tradition that declares it. We've invested in this piece. It declares us. And at the same time that it declares us, it makes a statement about our hope, our joy,
and our dreams,
our persistence, and our dreams that the world has to respect. And that is an important piece of what the legacy of Black Nativity is.
Okay. Now, we know Black Nativity is at its last weekend.
Yes, four more shows
Four
counting
more
tonight.
shows. So, briefly, can you tell folks what the show times are and where they can go
The
to get
show
tickets?
is being performed at the Paramount Center or the Paramount Theater in the Theater District. And we have matinees, which are on Saturday afternoon and Sunday afternoon at 3:30.
Okay.
And we have evening performances at 8 o'clock on tonight, Friday, and on Saturday. So those are the four shows that are still available. And you can get tickets, of course, at the box office, but you can also purchase tickets online at blacknativity.org. Now, if you're buying the tickets online, make sure that you're at the right site, because there are resellers out there. And if the ticket price looks funny to you, double check and make sure you've got the right site.
Okay. Mr. Edmond Barry Gaither, thank you for being with us this afternoon.
And thank you for this golden
Talking
opportunity.
about Black Nativity, because I was so excited, and I'm glad you gave me a history that I've known, because I remember being in Black Nativity as a child, you know, and as a teen. You know,
I've only been in as a wise man.
I remember you being a wise man, you know. So thank you so much. I so much appreciate it.
I love the Lord.